Frost crusted the inside of the window pane, thick enough to scrape off with a thumbnail. Lily didn't bother. There was nothing out there worth looking at anyway, just a white expanse of a dying village, suffocating under a 3-week blizzard. She sat by a hearth that held more grey ash than embers her hands wrapped around a chipped wooden bowl. Inside was her salvation, half a boiled potato grey and waxy, floating in a broth made from melted snow and a single withered onion skin. It smelled like wet dirt. Her stomach violently contracted a physical cramp that folded her in half, leaving her gasping at the cold floorboards. Starvation wasn't a slow fade. It was an active, violent animal, tearing at the inside of her ribs. A knock rattled the thin wooden door. Lily froze. The spoon whittled from cheap pine, halted halfway to her cracked lips. Nobody knocked during a whiteout. You huddled by your fire and prayed the roof held. The knock came again, weaker this time. A pathetic scraping sound, like a dog pawing to get in out of the wet. Lily set the bowl down. Her hands shook. She wrapped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the cheap wool scratching against her collarbone. She unlatched the iron hook and pulled the door open, just a crack, letting in a shriek of wind that instantly killed her meager fire. A woman stood on the threshold. She was small, bundled in rags that smelled foul, a potent, stomach-churning mix of wet animal fur, old blood, and damp earth. Mud and ice clung to the hem of her skirts. Her face was hidden beneath a heavy sodden cowl, but her hands were visible. They were clawed, shaking violently, skin pulled taut over bone like ancient parchment. "Please," the woman croaked. The voice sounded like dry leaves crushed underfoot. A scrap. Anything. Lily stared at her. A surge of pure, ugly resentment flared in her chest. No, that was her first thought. I am starving. I am dying in this freezing box, and you want my dirt water broth. She wanted to slam the door. She wanted to lock it and eat her miserable potato in the dark, savoring every miserable bite. She began to push the door closed. The old woman didn't resist. She didn't beg again. She just swayed her knees, buckling slightly, and let out a soft, shuddering exhale that rattled with phlegm. She looked like she was simply going to lie down in the snowdrift on Lily's porch and die. Lily's jaw clenched. She hated herself in that moment. She hated her own weakness. "Get inside." Lily snapped, her voice harsh, cracking from disuse. She grabbed the woman by a filthy sleeve and yanked her over the threshold. The old woman stumbled, falling to her knees on the floorboards. She stayed there, panting, a puddle of melted snow already forming around her. Lily didn't offer her a chair. She didn't offer a blanket. She walked back to the hearth, picked up the chipped wooden bowl, and walked back to the woman. She thrust it down. "Eat it and get out," Lily said. The woman looked up. Beneath the cowl, her eyes were an unnatural, piercing amber. They didn't belong in that hollowed-out face. They were sharp, feral, and deeply unsettling. The woman took the bowl with trembling hands. She didn't use the spoon. She brought the rim to her mouth and drank the broth in 3 loud, desperate gulps, then tipped the half-potato into her mouth, chewing with a frantic, animalistic intensity. Lily watched her, her own stomach twisted in agony, screaming at the loss. She swallowed hard, tasting bile. She felt no warmth of charity, no glowing pride of a good deed done. She only felt a hollow, terrifying panic. She had just given away her tomorrow. The woman finished. She dragged a filthy sleeve across her mouth, leaving a streak of dirt on her chin. She looked at the empty bowl, then up at Lily. "You are hungry," the woman stated. It wasn't a question. "I was," Lily replied, crossing her arms to hide her trembling. "Now I'm empty. Leave." The woman slowly pushed herself to her feet. The stench of wet dog seemed to fill the tiny cabin, overpowering the smell of ash. She reached out a bony hand, hovering just an inch from Lily's cheek. Lily flinched away, repulsed. "You gave me your life," the woman whispered, the amber eyes locking onto Lily's dull brown ones. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to drag your corpse off my porch in the morning." Lily lied. It was a vicious lie born of defensiveness and fear. The woman didn't look offended. A strange, slow smile stretched her cracked lips, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white for a beggar. A pragmatic heart. Good. The soft ones die first. She turned and opened the door. The wind howled, whipping snow into the cabin. The woman stepped out into the blizzard, and before Lily could slam the door shut, she was gone, swallowed by the white. Lily stood alone in the freezing cabin. She locked the door. She walked to the hearth, picked up the empty wooden bowl, and sat down on the floor. She brought the bowl to her face and licked the inside, trying to taste the ghost of the potato. She tasted only wood and her own salty spit. She curled into a tight ball, wrapped her arms around her knees, and cried. Not out of sadness, but out of pure, unadulterated hunger and profound, bitter regret. 4 days bled into one another, distinguished only by the fading of the light and the deepening of the cold. Lily chewed on strips of boiled leather cut from an old boot. It tasted of salt and rot, but it gave her jaw something to do and tricked her stomach for a few miserable minutes at a time. The blizzard finally broke on the 5th morning, leaving a blinding crystalline sky and snowdrifts that buried the village to the window sills. Silence hung heavy over the valley. It was the silence of a graveyard. Then came the sound. It started as a low rhythmic thudding, vibrating through the frozen earth before it reached the air. Lily felt it in the floorboards beneath her boots. She stopped chewing the leather. She dragged a stool to the window, wiped away the fresh layer of condensation with her sleeve, and peered out. Down the main artery of the village, a rutted, snow-choked path lined with miserable hovels, a procession was moving. It wasn't a merchant caravan. It was a column of armed men riding massive, thick-coated destriers that ploughed through the snowdrifts like ships through water. The men wore heavy plate over dark furs, the metal dull and scratched, bearing the marks of recent heavy violence. Black banners snapped in the biting wind, emblazoned with the silver sigil of a snarling wolf's head. House Ethelgard. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Lily's exhaustion. The northern lords didn't visit villages like hers to distribute grain. They came to tax, to conscript, or to burn. Behind the vanguard came a massive enclosed carriage completely incongruous with the terrain. It was constructed of dark, polished oak and reinforced with iron bands, drawn by 6 draft horses. It looked less like a noble's transport and more like a rolling fortress. But it was the riders flanking the carriage that made Lily's breath catch in her throat. They weren't on horses. They rode nothing yet kept pace with the destriers effortlessly. They were men, or at least shaped like men, but they moved with a loose, predatory grace that raised the hairs on Lily's arms. They wore little armor, just thick furs, draped over broad, heavily muscled shoulders. Even from a distance, she could see the unnatural glow of their eyes. Werewolves, the king's personal guard. The rumors were true then. The king had abandoned the capital and come north. A harsh, booming voice shattered the quiet. "Out, everyone, out of your homes, by order of King Garrick." Out. Soldiers dismounted, wading through the snow to kick at doors. Wood splintered. Shouts erupted. A woman 2 houses down screamed as she was dragged by her hair onto the street, her husband bleeding into the snow beside her as he tried to intervene. Lily didn't wait for her door to be kicked in. She dropped the piece of leather. Her legs felt like water, trembling violently as she unlocked her door and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The cold hit her like a physical blow, slicing through her thin clothes. The air smelled suddenly overwhelmingly of ozone, hot copper, and wet fur. It was a heavy, suffocating scent that made her eyes water. Soldiers herded the surviving villagers, perhaps 50 in total, mostly the very old, the sick, and women, toward the frozen mud of the village square. Lily stumbled along, keeping her head down her bare hands, tucked into her armpits. She noticed the way the wolf guards moved. They didn't herd. They stalked. They sniffed the air, their heads turning with sharp, jerky movements, locking onto scents invisible to the humans. The villagers were pushed into a tight cluster. Silence fell again, broken only by the snorting of horses and the weeping of a terrified child. A man detached himself from the vanguard and rode his massive black horse to the front of the crowd. He didn't wear a crown. He didn't need to. Power radiated off him in a palpable wave, heavy and suffocating. King Garrick. He was massive, his chest barrel thick beneath layers of dark steel and wolf pelt. His face was a map of old violence. A jagged scar tore through his left eyebrow and vanished into his thick, dark beard. His eyes were not human. They were the color of forged iron cold and heavy, missing the amber glow of the guards, but holding twice the menace. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his posture, though imposing, held a rigid tension, as if he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. He didn't look at the villagers with disgust or pity. He looked at them like a farmer looks at a barren field. 2 days ago, Garrick's voice carried easily a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Lily's chest. A woman passed through this territory, an elder, traveling alone. He paused, scanning the terrified faces. My mother. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The Queen Mother. Here traveling like a vagabond in the dead of winter. It made no sense. She was lost during the storm. Garrick continued, his jaw tightening. She was separated from the escort. We tracked her scent to this perimeter. He leaned forward over the pommel of his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. She was found, alive, barely. Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. A woman, an elder, wet animal fur, amber eyes, the beggar. The iron-eyed king drew his sword. The steel hissed against the scabbard, a loud, lethal sound in the frozen air. She told me, Garrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register, that this village shut their doors to her. She told me she knocked on 5 doors. 5 doors locked against an old woman in a whiteout. He pointed the tip of his sword at the front row of villagers. Which of you denied her step forward? Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Lily felt a cold sweat break out down her spine, despite the freezing temperature. She hadn't denied her. She had let her in. She had fed her. But she had done it with hatred. She had shoved the bowl at her. She had practically cursed her. Would that matter to a werewolf king looking for blood? No one. Garrick sneered. Cowards, you leave an old woman to freeze, and you lack the spine to own your cruelty. He turned his head slightly toward the massive carriage. Bring her out. The heavy oak door of the carriage swung open. Two massive wolf guards reached inside, their brutal movements strangely gentle as they assisted a figure down the iron steps. She was draped in magnificent thick furs of snow leopard and silver fox. A heavy woolen cloak dyed a rich dark crimson swept the snow behind her. But as she stepped into the harsh sunlight, Lily saw the face. It was her, the beggar. She looked less frail now, standing upright, leaning on a polished weirwood cane. The grime was gone from her face, revealing sharp aristocratic bone structure beneath the wrinkles. But the eyes were exactly the same. Piercing feral amber. Queen Mother Ingrid walked slowly to the front of the carriage, stopping beside her son's warhorse. She didn't look at Garrick. She looked at the crowd. Smell them, Garrick commanded his guards. Find the cowards, stink on them. Quiet, Garrick, Ingrid snapped. Her voice was no longer the dry rattle of a dying woman. It was a whip crack of authority. Even the massive king flinched slightly, his jaw clenching tight. Ingrid swept her gaze over the huddled, shivering mass of peasants. Lily tried to shrink backward, to hide behind the broad shoulders of the blacksmith's wife. She wanted to vanish into the snow. She didn't want a reward. She didn't want recognition. She just wanted to survive the day. If the Queen Mother pointed her out, what would happen? She had fed the woman-peasant slop. She had yelled at her. Nobles had executed people for less than a lack of courtesy. Ingrid's amber eyes scanned the first row, the second. Then they stopped. Even from 20 feet away, Lily felt the physical weight of that gaze lock onto her. There, Ingrid said, raising one claw-like ring-laden finger. She pointed directly at Lily. Bring that one to me. Two guards surged forward. The crowd scrambled out of their way, shoving each other into the snow to avoid the wolves. Lily was left exposed, standing alone in a small clearing of trampled snow. A heavy leather-clad hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was impossibly strong, biting into her collarbone. She was jerked forward, her bare boots slipping on the ice. She stumbled, nearly falling, but the guard dragged her upright, hauling her across the square until she was dumped roughly at the feet of the king's horse. Lily hit the frozen mud on her knees. The smell of the horse, the hot steel of the king, and the overwhelming scent of wet dog flooded her senses. She kept her head down, staring at the hem of Ingrid's crimson cloak. "Look up, girl," Ingrid commanded. Lily slowly raised her head. Her face was numb from the cold, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Is this the one?" Garrick asked, his iron eyes narrowing as he looked down at Lily. His nose twitched slightly. "She smells of nothing but ash and fear." "This is the one," Ingrid said. She leaned heavily on her cane, bending slightly to look closer at Lily's face. "The pragmatic heart. You denied my mother shelter." Garrick's voice was a low growl. The destrier shifted restlessly beneath him. "No," Lily blurted out, her voice cracking in panic. "I didn't. I opened the door." "You opened the door." Ingrid agreed, a strange grim smile playing on her lips. "And you hated me for it." Lily froze. The truth hung in the air, heavy and damning. She didn't try to lie. What was the point? They were wolves. They could probably smell the lie on her sweat. I was starving. Lily whispered the words, tearing from her throat, harsh and raw. I had half a potato left. It was my tomorrow. I gave it to you, and I hated you for taking it. But I gave it to you. Silence stretched across the square. The villagers behind her held their breath. Garrick stared down at her. The anger in his face fractured, replaced by a momentary flash of confusion. He looked at his mother. She speaks the truth, Ingrid said quietly. The others barred their doors. They prayed I would die quietly so they wouldn't have to hear it. This one. Ingrid tapped her cane against the frozen earth. She let me in out of spite. She fed me out of a furious refusal to let me die on her porch. It was the best meal I have had in a decade. Garrick sheathed his sword. The scrape of metal signaled a shift in the air, a sudden release of the immediate lethal tension. He looked back down at Lily. He didn't look at her with gratitude. He looked at her as a problem he now had to solve. A life for a life. That is the old law, Garrick said flatly. Yes, Ingrid agreed. She reached out and grasped Lily's chin with fingers that felt like cold iron. She gave me her tomorrow. We owe her one in return. She stays here then, Garrick said dismissively. Leave her a sack of grain and a side of salted meat. That pays the debt tenfold. No, Ingrid said. The word was absolute. Grain runs out. Meat rots. The debt is a life. She comes with us. Lily's eyes widened in horror. No, please, I don't want to. You don't have a choice, peasant. Garrick snarled, his patience snapping. My mother has claimed the debt. You belong to the crown now. He gestured to the guard standing behind Lily. Throw her in the supply wagon. Give her a blanket. We ride for the keep. Lily fought. It wasn't a heroic struggle. It was the frantic, pathetic thrashing of a trapped animal. She kicked at the guard's shins, screaming obscenities, scratching at the thick leather of his armor. It was entirely useless. The guard didn't even grunt. He simply wrapped an arm around her waist, lifting her off the ground as easily as a sack of flour, and carried her kicking and screaming toward the rear of the column. As she was hauled away, she caught one last glimpse of the king. Garrick was watching her, his jaw set, a look of profound annoyance on his scarred face. He wasn't a savior sweeping her off to a better life. He was a predator forced to carry a parasite because his mother demanded it. And Lily, starving, terrified, and furious, realized she hadn't been saved. She had just been claimed by the wolves. Burlap scraped against her cheek, rough as a rasp. Lily lay curled in the suffocating darkness of the supply wagon, her bones vibrating with every brutal jolt of the wooden wheels against the frozen road. She smelled raw oats, the metallic tang of old blood seeping from a stack of uncured hides, and her own stale, unwashed sweat. The journey lasted 3 days. She measured time by the halting of the wagon and the perfunctory tossing of a hardtack biscuit and a water skin into her dark corner. A guard would rip the canvas flap back, bringing a blinding stab of white daylight and a blast of sub-zero air, throw the rations and drop the flap before she could even blink against the glare. They didn't speak to her. She was cargo. Debt payment neatly tallied and stored. When the wagon finally ceased its relentless jarring, the silence that followed was oppressive. The canvas tore back. Rough hands grabbed her ankles and yanked. Lily hit the cobblestones hard, her knees taking the brunt of the impact. She gasped, tasting dust and the sharp bite of frost. "Get up," a voice grunted. She scrambled to her feet instinctively, throwing her arms over her head. But the guard was already walking away, joining a chaotic stream of men, horses, and unloading carts. Lily lowered her arms and stared. High Keep wasn't a castle. It was a scar carved into the side of a mountain. Massive slabs of dark, iron-veined granite jutted outward, looming over a sprawling courtyard. The architecture was brutalist, designed to break sieges and withstand winters that would snap a man in two. There were no decorative banners here, no tapestries softening the stonework. Everywhere she looked, braziers roared with actual wasteful fires, tossing thick black smoke into the grey sky. The noise was deafening. Blacksmith hammers rang out in a frantic, overlapping rhythm. Hounds bayed from distant kennels, a deep resonant sound that made the hairs on Lily's neck prickle. And the smell. It hit her like a physical wall. Roasting meat. Not the thin, watery scent of boiling bones she was used to, but thick, fat-dripping venison and pork. Her stomach seized violently, a painful, spasming cramp that bent her double. She retched dryly, spitting stringy saliva onto the stones. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel, stopping inches from her face. Lily looked up, squinting through watering eyes. King Garrick stood over her. Stripped of his heavy winter furs, he wore a simple linen tunic and leather braces, the cold seemingly having no effect on him. Up close, the sheer width of his shoulders was terrifying. He carried the scent of crushed pine needles, ozone, and cold iron. He stared down at her, his face a mask of profound irritation. "Stop vomiting in my courtyard," Garrick said, his voice a low rumble. "You smell like a corpse." "I am starving," Lily rasped, wiping her mouth with a trembling, dirt-caked hand. She didn't have the energy for fear, only raw, agonizing need. "You dragged me out of my home to starve me in a wagon." Garrick's iron-grey eyes narrowed. He leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. The heat radiating off his body was unnatural, like standing next to an open furnace. "You are here because my mother has a sentimental streak that borders on madness. You are not a guest, you are an obligation." He straightened up, snapping his fingers. An older woman, broad-shouldered and dressed in severe grey wool, stepped out from the shadows of an archway. "Hilda," Garrick commanded. "Take the debt, scrub the filth off her, feed her something that won't kill her empty stomach, then put her in the scullery. Out of my sight." The Queen Mother requested the girl be brought to her chambers. "My king," Hilda said, her voice completely devoid of inflection. Garrick's jaw muscles flexed, a low, vibrating sound, barely audible, but Lily felt it in her sternum emanated from his chest. It was a growl, an actual animal growl. "Clean her first," Garrick snapped, turning on his heel. "If she gives you trouble, throw her in the kennels." He walked away, the guards parting for him instantly, eyes averted to the cobblestones. Lily watched his broad back disappear into the keep, a fresh wave of nausea washing over her. She was surrounded by monsters. Lye soap burned like fire on broken skin. Lily sat in a copper tub, her knees pulled to her chest, shivering despite the scalding water. Two maids scrubbed her with stiff, bristled brushes, showing absolutely no mercy to her prominent ribs or bruised shoulders. They scraped away layers of ash dirt and dead skin until she was raw and glowing pink. They hauled her out, dried her roughly with coarse linen, and dropped a simple, undyed wool dress over her head. It was thick and heavy, warmer than anything she had ever owned, but it smelled sharply of mothballs and dried lavender. Hilda marched her into a small alcove off the kitchens and pointed to a wooden stool. On the table sat a bowl of thick, steaming oat porridge, sweetened with honey, and a heel of fresh, dark bread. Lily stared at it. Her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them together. She wanted to dive into the bowl, face first. She wanted to swallow it whole. But a deep, primal instinct, the instinct that had kept her alive through the famine, warned her, "Too much too fast, and you will die." She picked up the bread. It was soft. Real bread, not the sawdust-laced bricks the village baker had sold before he starved. She took a tiny bite. The sweetness of the grain hit her tongue, and tears, hot and humiliating, welled in her eyes. She chewed slowly, agonizingly slowly, forcing herself to swallow before taking another small bite. Hilda watched her with flat eyes. Smart. Most of the starved gorge themselves and end up vomiting blood by nightfall. Finish half. No more. Lily did as she was told. When she pushed the half-empty bowl away, the physical pain of stopping was almost as bad as the hunger itself. She covertly slipped the remaining crust of bread into the deep pocket of her woolen dress. Old habits were carved into bone. "Come," Hilda said. "The Queen Mother is waiting." The interior of High Keep was a labyrinth of echoing stone corridors, lit by flickering torchlight that cast long, monstrous shadows. The air grew warmer, heavier, perfumed with burning sandalwood as they ascended the spiraling stairs of the eastern tower. Hilda stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with silver filigree and knocked once. "Enter." The voice was sharp, holding none of the frailty of the beggar woman. Hilda opened the door and pushed Lily inside, shutting it firmly behind her. The room was suffocatingly opulent. Thick Myrish carpets swallowed the sound of Lily's footsteps. Tapestries depicting brutal hunts lined the walls. Heat blasted from a massive hearth where whole logs popped and hissed. Queen Mother Ingrid sat in a high-backed velvet chair by the fire. She wore a gown of dark green silk, her silver hair pulled back severely. The feral amber eyes locked onto Lily immediately. "You look less like a drowned rat." Ingrid observed her tone conversational. She gestured with a ringed hand to a stool near her feet. "Sit." Lily didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your son ordered me to the scullery." "My son is a brute who thinks entirely with his teeth," Ingrid said dismissively. "Sit down." Lily slowly crossed the room and perched on the edge of the stool. The heat from the fire was intense, making her skin prickle under the heavy wool dress. "You stole bread from the kitchens," Ingrid stated. Lily's blood ran cold. How could she possibly know she had been entirely alone with Hilda? Her hand instinctively twitched toward her pocket. Ingrid laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. "I can smell the yeast on you, girl, and the panic. Keep it, but know that no one starves in High Keep unless they cross me." The old woman leaned forward, her amber eyes reflecting the flames. "You are angry. You feel you have been stolen." "I was stolen," Lily said. Her voice was quiet, but the resentment was a living thing in her throat. "I saved your life, and my reward is to be a prisoner. You saved my life because you were too stubborn to let me die on your doorstep. It was an act of defiance, not compassion." Ingrid's lips curled into a half smile. "That is why you are here. My court is full of sycophants who would cut off their own hands to feed me, hoping for a sliver of favor. They bore me. They are weak. You looked a starving, dying woman in the eye and hated her for needing you. You are raw. I am nothing. Lily shot back, the anger finally burning through her fear. I am just trying to survive. The heavy oak door suddenly slammed open, hitting the stone wall with a crack like a musket shot. King Garrick filled the doorway. He had changed into a dark tunic, his hair damp from washing, but the dark circles under his iron eyes were deeper. He strode into the room, bringing the sharp scent of the winter wind with him, completely obliterating the sandalwood. He didn't look at Lily. He looked at his mother. The border patrols report movement in the crag. Garrick said, his voice tight with suppressed violence. The rogue packs are testing the boundaries again. Then send the vanguard to slaughter them. Ingrid replied smoothly, not taking her eyes off Lily. I came to tell you, I am riding out tonight, Garrick said. He finally glanced down. His eyes caught on Lily sitting rigidly on the stool. His nostrils flared slightly. He stepped closer, towering over her. Lily fought the overwhelming urge to cower. She kept her chin level, staring at the thick leather belt at his waist. You reek of stolen bread, Garrick said quietly. Lily's jaw clenched. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the crushed, lint-covered crust of dark bread, and slammed it down on the small table next to her stool. There. She snapped, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of terror and rage. Take it. Hang me for it. I don't care. Just stop looking at me like I'm something you stepped in. Silence dropped over the room like a lead weight. Ingrid let out a soft, sharp intake of breath. Garrick stared at the bread crust. Then slowly, he looked at Lily's face. The annoyance vanished, replaced by something much darker, much more dangerous. The iron grey of his eyes seemed to fracture a ring of gold bleeding around his pupils. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers. The heat of his skin was staggering. Do not ever. Garrick whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal bass frequency. Raise your voice to me in my own keep. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and swept out of the room, the heavy door slamming shut behind him, leaving the air in the chamber vibrating with the force of his exit. Lily sat frozen, her chest heaving, staring at the closed door. Ingrid chuckled. Well, the Queen Mother murmured. It seems you have a spine, after all. Try not to let him snap it. 3 weeks passed. The cycle of the moon dragged heavily over High Keep, and with it, a suffocating tension settled into the stones. Lily was officially assigned as the Queen Mother's reader, a title that practically meant she was Ingrid's captive audience. She sat in the stifling, perfume-heavy chambers for hours, reading ancient histories of the Northern Territories from heavy, mouldering tomes. Ingrid rarely listened. She spent most of the time staring into the hearth, her amber eyes unfocused, occasionally interjecting with cryptic, cynical remarks about the dead lords Lily was reading about. But when Lily wasn't with Ingrid, she was invisible. The keep was a hierarchy of teeth and claws. The human servants scuttled through the corridors with their eyes down, communicating in hushed whispers. The wolves, the guards, the huntsmen, the aristocracy of the keep moved with arrogant, predatory grace. They didn't shift into beasts in the halls, but the beast was always present, right beneath their skin. Lily saw it in the way they tore into half-raw venison in the great hall, the way a simple disagreement over a dice game would escalate into a terrifying, snarling standoff with bared teeth and glowing eyes. She learned to walk softly. She learned to hide the scent of her own fear, or at least to mask it with the sharp smell of lye soap. She was regaining her strength. Her cheekbones were no longer sharp enough to cut glass, and the bruises from the wagon ride had faded to dull yellow. But the physical recovery did nothing to ease the constant grinding anxiety. The worst of it was the king. Garrick had returned from the border skirmish a week ago, bringing back the metallic stink of blood and 3 dead guards. Since then, his presence in the keep was a dark, brooding storm system. He didn't speak to Lily. He rarely looked at her, but she felt him. If she was walking down the eastern colonnade and he entered the far end, the air pressure shifted. The fine hairs on her arms would stand up. It was a visceral biological reaction, a prey animal registering the apex predator in its territory. It came to a head on the night of the waxing gibbous. The keep was restless. The howling from the kennels had turned into a chaotic, aggressive chorus that rattled the glass in the windows. Lily had been dismissed early by Ingrid, who was suffering from a migraine, which Lily had learned was wolf code for the agonizing sensitivity that preceded the full moon. Lily hurried through the dimly lit corridors toward her small freezing cell in the servants' quarters. She took a shortcut through the abandoned armory, desperate to avoid the main halls where the guards were drinking heavily. The armory was pitch black, smelling of rust and old leather. Lily navigated by memory, keeping her hand trailing along the cold stone wall. Suddenly, a massive shape separated itself from the shadows. Lily gasped, stumbling backward. A heavy hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm in a vice grip. She was yanked forward, crashing into a solid wall of muscle and heat. "Quiet," a voice rasped. It was Garrick. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against hers. In the gloom, she could see his face. It was wrong. The harsh angles of his jaw were shifting the skin, pulling tight over bone. His teeth, faintly visible in the dim light filtering from the corridor, were elongated, impossibly sharp. The iron grey of his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a burning, incandescent gold. He was fighting the shift. Lily froze completely. The instinct to scream was choked off by pure terror. The smell of him was overwhelming, pine-hot copper and the raw, musky scent of a wild animal. Garrick's grip on her arm tightened painfully. He dragged her deeper into the shadows of the armory, pressing her back against a rack of cold iron spears. He planted a heavy hand on the wall beside her head, leaning in close. "What are you doing down here?" He ground out the words, distorted by his shifting jaw. "Returning to my quarters," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. She pressed herself flat against the spear rack, trying to put even an inch of space between them. Garrick closed his eyes. A tremor violently shook his massive frame. He let out a ragged exhale that brushed hot against her neck. "You shouldn't be wandering. Not tonight. The pack is volatile. I took a shortcut." She stammered, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. "Let me go." He opened his eyes. The gold was searing, pinning her in place. He didn't let go. Instead, he leaned closer, his nose brushing the line of her jaw. He inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite. She waited for him to lose control and tear her throat out. "You don't smell like ash and fear anymore," Garrick murmured. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through her own bones. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded completely, terrifyingly exhausted. "You smell like lavender soap and anger." "I am angry," Lily breathed, opening her eyes. The proximity was intoxicating and repulsive all at once. "I am a prisoner in a castle of monsters." Garrick laughed, a harsh barking sound that was more wolf than man. He pulled back slightly, looking down at her. The golden light in his eyes flared, then slowly, agonizingly began to recede, bleeding back into iron grey. The sharp edges of his teeth dulled. He was wrestling the beast back down, forcing it under his skin by sheer willpower. "We are all prisoners here, little bird," Garrick said, the gravel returning to his voice. The grip on her arm loosened, but he didn't step away. "Some cages are just made of stone, and others are made of blood." He stared at her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his scarred face. It was the first time he had looked at her not as a debt, not as a peasant, but as a person. Then the mask slammed back into place. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the cold, arrogant king. He stepped back, the heat of his body abruptly withdrawing. "Stay out of the main halls," Garrick commanded sharply. "If a guard catches you in the dark tonight, I won't be able to stop them. Go." He turned and melted back into the shadows of the armory, moving with a terrifying silence. Lily stood frozen against the spears for a long time, her knees shaking, her skin burning where he had touched her. She touched her own neck, her fingers trembling. The sheer, overwhelming power of him had left her light-headed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was tangled in the very center of the wolf's den, and the most terrifying part wasn't that the king was a monster. The terrifying part was that for one fleeting second in the dark, she had understood the monster completely. Moonlight did not soften the jagged edges of High Keep. It weaponized them. By midnight, the waxing gibbous swelled into a bloated, pale eye, dragging the underlying madness of the pack to the surface. Lily sat huddled in her unheated cell, a heavy mothball-scented woolen blanket pulled tightly over her head, desperately trying to drown out the noise. It wasn't just howling. Howling would have been manageable. It was the sound of heavy bodies slamming violently against reinforced oak doors down the lower corridors. It was the sickening wet crunch of bones snapping and reforming, a biological horror occurring over and over again. The air bleeding under her door smelled of raw meat urine and copper so pungent it coated the back of her throat. The wolves were awake. Footsteps approached her door, not the pacing, clicking claws of a beast, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a human, walking with purpose. A key grated harshly in the iron lock. Hilda stood in the threshold, holding a sputtering tallow candle that cast hollow skull-like shadows across her severe face. She carried a thick iron crowbar in her free hand, her knuckles white. "Up," Hilda ordered. Her voice lacked its usual flat calm. It was tight, laced with adrenaline. Queen Mother's summons. Lily didn't argue. Survival in this castle meant obedience when the beasts were loose. She threw off the blanket, her boots already laced. She never took them off anymore, and followed the old woman into the suffocating gloom of the corridor. They ascended higher than Lily had ever been permitted, bypassing Ingrid's perfume-soaked chambers for the narrow, winding stairwell of the highest watchtower. Bitter sub-zero wind whipped through the open stone archways of the tower peak, cutting right through Lily's dress. Ingrid stood wrapped in voluminous layers of black sable, leaning heavily on the frost-covered parapet. She didn't bother to look back as Lily approached, her amber eyes fixed downward. "Look down," Ingrid commanded. Her voice barely cut through the howling wind and the deafening cacophony rising from the courtyard below. Lily stepped to the edge. Her stomach lurched violently. The massive stone courtyard was a writhing, chaotic mass of fur fangs and blood. Dozens of wolves, massive and terrifyingly feral, tore at deer carcasses tossed from the lower balconies by human servants. But they weren't just eating. They were fighting. Dominance was not a polite political title here. It was a physical argument settled exclusively with teeth and claws. She watched a massive timber wolf pin a smaller grey one to the frozen stones, its jaws closing around the throat with a sickening finality, shaking until a brutal snap echoed up the stone walls. "Horrifying, isn't it?" Ingrid murmured, the wind snatching the words from her mouth. Lily gripped the frozen stone until her fingers went numb. "It's a butcher's yard. It is survival." Ingrid pointed a ringed, claw-like finger toward the epicenter of the chaos. "Find my son." It took a moment to single him out in the slaughterhouse below. Then she saw him. He wasn't participating in the frenzy of the fresh meat. He stood apart, a monstrous silhouette of pitch-black fur and corded muscle dwarfing the largest of the other alphas. He wasn't eating. He was policing. A hulking brown wolf lunged blindly for a younger, bleeding female. In a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to properly track, the black wolf intercepted. Garrick hit the brown wolf broadside with the sheer crushing force of a battering ram. The impact echoed off the courtyard walls, a heavy thud of bone on bone. He didn't just bite, he dismantled. Within seconds, the brown wolf was dragging itself away, whimpering, leaving a thick, steaming trail of crimson on the frost. Garrick stood over the blood spatter, his massive chest heaving a terrifying monument to absolute violence. "He hates this," Ingrid said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual cynical edge. "Every month he breaks his own bones to become that thing, just to keep them from tearing the keep and each other apart. He despises the beast, but without it, the pack turns inward. We would be dead in a fortnight." Lily stared at the massive black wolf. She remembered the suffocating heat of him in the dark armory, the terrifying vibrating tremor of his control as he fought to stay human. "Why show me this?" Lily asked, her voice shaking from the cold and the horror. "Because you look at him and you see a tyrant who dragged you from your home," Ingrid replied, turning her sharp gaze onto Lily. "I need you to see the cage. He is as much a prisoner of this mountain as you are, girl. Perhaps more. You can walk away one day if you survive. He never will." Lily looked back down at the carnage. The black wolf threw its massive head back and unleashed a howl that rattled the marrow in Lily's bones. It wasn't a sound of triumph or bloodlust. It sounded like pure, unadulterated agony. Morning arrived like a collective hangover. Ash-grey light filtered through the arrow slits, illuminating a courtyard smeared with dark, frozen stains. The howling had ceased, completely replaced by the hushed, urgent voices of servants scrubbing the stones with bleach and the groans of men nursing broken limbs in the infirmary. Lily was sent to the king's chambers with a heavy wooden bucket of boiling water, lye soap, and a bundle of clean linen. Hilda had thrust the items into her hands in the kitchens, refusing to make eye contact, muttering something bitter about the regular attendants being too terrified to go near him, while the beast was still settling beneath his skin. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on one massive iron hinge. Lily nudged it open with her shoulder, stepping over a shattered vase. The room looked like a battlefield. Heavy woven tapestries were torn from their iron rods, shredded into ribbons. A massive oak table was cracked clean down the center, and sitting on the edge of a massive ruined bed amidst a sea of torn feathers and blood-stained sheets was Garrick. He was human again. He wore only a pair of loose linen trousers, barefoot on the cold stone. He was covered in blood, though very little of it seemed to be his own. Deep, vicious scratches scored his broad chest and back, and a dark, ugly bruise bloomed across his jaw. He sat slumped forward, his head resting in his hands, staring blankly at a smear of blood on the floorboards. He didn't look up when she entered. He just breathed slow, rattling exhales that sounded wet and painful. Lily set the bucket down. The metal handle clanked loudly against the rim. Still he didn't move. She soaked a thick cloth in the steaming water, wringing it out until her palms burned. Her hands were surprisingly steady. The panic from the night before had burned itself out, leaving only a strange, cold clarity in her chest. She stepped into his line of sight. The smell of him up close was entirely feral sweat, old blood, and wet dog. "You need to wash," she said quietly. Garrick slowly raised his head. His iron-grey eyes were entirely bloodshot, surrounded by deep, bruised rings of exhaustion. The terrifying apex predator from the courtyard was gone, leaving only a ruined, exhausted man. "Get out," he rasped. His vocal cords were completely shredded, the words grinding out like stones crushed under a cartwheel. "No," Lily said. She didn't yell. She stated it as an absolute fact. She stepped closer, reaching out, and pressed the scalding wet cloth against a long, jagged gash on his shoulder. Garrick flinched violently, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. His hand shot up with lightning speed, his long fingers clamping around her wrist with bruising, terrifying force. The gold flared momentarily in his eyes, a dying ember of the beast's fury fighting to reignite. I said. He growled, the vibration traveling up her arm. "Get out." Lily didn't pull away. She didn't struggle. She looked down at him, holding his bloodshot gaze, refusing to be the prey. "I saw you last night, from the watchtower with Ingrid." The gold in his eyes flickered, fractured, and died completely. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, his fingers going slack, though he didn't drop his hand. "Then you know exactly what I am," he whispered, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a hollow defeat. "You know why you shouldn't be within 10 feet of me." "I know you tear each other apart," Lily said, her voice dropping into a quiet, hard register. "I know you hate the taste of it, and I know your mother thinks the fact that we are both trapped makes us the same." Garrick finally let go of her wrist. He slumped back his spine, hitting the thick wooden bedpost with a dull thud. He closed his eyes. "My mother is a sentimental fool who reads too much into the mud. We are nothing alike. You are a peasant girl dragged from the snow. I am a monster forged by bloodlines to rule other monsters." Lily dipped the cloth back into the bloody water, ignoring his self-pity. She wrung it out again and moved to wipe a thick smear of gore from his collarbone. "I let a beggar into my house because I was too angry and too spiteful to let her win by dying on my porch. You break your own body every 30 days because you are too stubborn to let your wretched pack destroy itself. We are both just surviving a winter that never ends, Garrick." It was the first time she had used his name. It hung in the quiet, ruined room, a heavy, dangerous thing, completely stripping away the titles of king and servant. Garrick opened his eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the cynical armor she wore, the stubborn, defiant tilt of her chin, the way she refused to flinch even when standing inches from a man who could snap her neck with 2 fingers. He saw the grim pragmatism that mirrored his own. He reached out. This time his movement was slow, deliberate, entirely human. His large, calloused hand cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. The contrast was staggering, his hands built for tearing flesh and breaking bone, touching her with profound, exhausted reverence. "You aren't afraid of me anymore." He noted, his voice barely a breath. "I'm terrified of you," Lily corrected softly. But she didn't pull back. She leaned into his palm a fraction of an inch, a tiny, monumental surrender of her pride. "But I'm more terrified of the cold." Garrick let out a ragged breath that sounded like a dry sob. He pulled her forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his broad shoulders shaking. He didn't kiss her. He didn't demand anything. He just breathed her in the sharp lye soap, the stubbornness, the raw, undeniable humanity of her that anchored him back to himself. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then wrapped her arms around his battered, bleeding back. She closed her eyes, inhaling the heavy scent of ozone and iron. She was still a captive in high keep. She was still surrounded by a den of beasts. But as she held the Alpha King while he shattered into 1,000 pieces against her chest, Lily realized the bitter debt she owed was finally paid. She wasn't just surviving the wolves anymore. She was learning to survive the winter with one of them. Did Lily's fierce defiance and King Garrick's hidden vulnerability capture your heart? The savage world of High Keep is just the beginning of their complicated, untamed romance. If you loved this deep dive into medieval werewolf drama, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy romance fans, and don't forget to subscribe, ring the notification bell, so you never miss another thrilling, monstrous love story.